Hello everyone, and welcome to the lecture on iterators and generators in Python. In this lecture, we'll look at iterators, we'll see what iterators are, and in the next lecture, we'll look at generators. Let's start by looking at what iterators are. Iterators are Python objects that can be iterated upon and return results one at a time. So far, we have seen the implementation of iterators within for loops, for example. Objects like strings, lists, and tuples are called iterable objects. That's because we can get an iterator out of them or from them. Iterator objects implement these two methods known as the iter method and the next method or functions. Okay. So again, iterators are Python objects which can be iterated upon and return data one at a time. Let's look at an example and see what these iterators are. Let's start by creating a list object and save it in a variable called list1. Let's say our list contains the following numbers: 23, 24, 26, 28, and 29. Now that we have our list object, if we check the type of our list object, we see that it's a list. And we can use the iter method. We can use the iter method to get an iterator object from our list. So we have iter, and then we simply pass our list object 1. Okay, now we have a list iterator object, and then we can save this object in a variable. Let's save it, for instance, in a variable called x. Now if we call x, we see that it's a list iterator object and location in memory. Again, we can also check the type of our object x, and it's a list iterator. And now that we have our list iterator object, we can call the next method to iterate through this list iterator object. So how can we do that? We simply call the next method and then pass our list iterator object, which is x. So when we call next and then x, we get 23, which is the first element in our object, in our list. And then to get the next element, we have to call the next function again. So we call next and then pass x. We get 24. So we keep calling the next method or function to get each of the elements one at a time. So remember, iterators are Python objects that can be iterated upon and return data or results one at a time. So that's what it's doing here. So it will keep giving us the next item. Okay, and it knows where it left off. So we got 26, and then we will get 28 and 29. So next, and then pass x, we get 28. And then to get the next element, we call the next function again, and we get 29. Now, all of the items are seen here, right? What will happen if we call the next function now? So in this case, we'll get a stop iteration exception. Let me run it and show you. So stop iteration. That means when all our results are returned one at a time, the next time we call the next function, we get a stop iteration exception. So when all the items are returned, the next time we call next, we get this stop iteration. Now if we call next x again, we still get the stop iteration. Okay, what do we have to do in order to use this iterable object? So we still have to save it. We can save it in the same variable and run the whole thing again. So now if you call next x, we will get 23 and so on. Or another thing we can do, we can save it in a different variable. Let's say y is equal to iter, and then we pass our list1 object, and then we call our next function and then pass our iterable object y. Run it, we get 23, and then next y will get 24, and then when we call the next function again, we get the next element, then 28, 29, and finally we get the stop iteration exception. And earlier I mentioned that strings, lists, and tuples are iterable objects, right? That means we can iterate through tuples and string elements. Let's see an example. Let's create a string and save it in a variable called string1, str1, and let's say iterators. So if we check the type of our str1 object, we see that it's a string. And same thing as we did with lists, we can use the iter method to get an iterator object from our string object here. So we say iter and then pass our string1 object. So now we have an iterator object and its location in memory. We can save this in a variable called, let's say, string iter, or any name that you like. Now we can use the next method. We can call the next method to get the result, to return the result from our string. So we call our next method or function and then pass our string iterable object, and this would give us I, the first element. And then similarly we can call the next function and find the next element that will give us the next element in our string iterable object. So this result, if we try to check the type of this function, the result of this function, we see that it's a string. So for instance, if I check the type of this object, I see that it's a string. So that means we can use any of the string functions on this object. For instance, let's save this in a variable called x. So x is equal to that. Now if we call x, we get a, since we stopped at a. Remember, the next method remembers where it left off last time. So we have a, and type of a is a string. So we can use methods on our string. For instance, we can say, we can check if our string is upper or not, and this will give us false, right? We can check other methods, for instance, is lower, and that should return true. And if we call x, we have what? A, right? Now let's call our next function and pass our string iterable object. Remember, last time we printed a, right? This time we'll get t, because the next function remembers where it left off last time. So we got t, And then if we call the next method on our string iterable object, we get O, and then next R and S. So if we call it again, we get R, and finally we get S. After this, we get the stop iteration exception, right? Stop iteration. So now we know that the iteration is over. And if we want to do the same thing, we have to save our iterable object. We have to save our iterable object in some variable and then call the next function on the iterable object until we get the stop iteration exception. So this iteration is somehow configured or implemented within for loops. We've seen that we can say for numbers in our list1 object that we created earlier, the list containing 23, 24, 28 and something. So for numbers in list1, we can say print numbers. So here if we run this, we get 23, 24, 26, 28 and 29, right? That's because for loops create an iterator object and somehow call the next function internally. Okay, that's why for loops implement this iteration and give us this result. Okay, just to recap, we saw what iterators are, and we mentioned that iterators are Python objects which can be iterated upon and return data one at a time. And we mentioned that they implement the next and iter methods. So iterator objects implement these two methods, and by using the iter method we can change an object or get an iterator from our object, like strings and tuples and even lists. Okay, great. In the next lecture we'll look at generators. Thank you everyone.